Hello and welcome to the Daily Toronto News for Wednesday, January the 10th, 2019. You ever felt like you can sort of tell when you're finally doing something right because you're being met with either total silence, like just being ignored, and then also the people who are acknowledging you are completely flipping out? That's what's happened with the activists here in Toronto who yesterday staged a massive protest in support of the Wet'suwet'en movement in BC against the LNG pipeline that RCMP are pushing through. So I'm going to go through the Toronto news about that and then the update from Wet'suwet'en. So yesterday, peaking with the total shutdown of the Bloor Viaduct, Toronto activists participated in the Shutdown Canada wave of activism in support of the Unistoten camp. But if you were in Toronto and you didn't know about it through social media, the only way you would have found out about it, either during or after, is through the traffic reports. So it's probably good that they ended up. This is why activists make huge traffic block, just because the press doesn't like to report on anti-pollution activism as it's ongoing. So while this massive protest was going down here in Toronto, and while they were taking traffic breaks to talk about how there was a big, commuting disruption to the height of evening rush hour because of a protest. They were calling it a protest. They refused to connect it with and it's funny because they were talking about it at the time. So on CBC Radio 1, they had, let's see, I'm like nervous today in a way that I haven't been previously. It's because I'm really surprised at what Global and CTV and the CBC all together kind of did with this, how they played it. So CBC on the radio, as it happens, the radio show As It Happens was airing during the protest here in Toronto. But instead of, which it wasn't hard to find out about it. I didn't find out about it because, I suck at finding out about stuff. I will improve and I will bring you news about upcoming protests. But for journalists who are covering this, it's easy to find out about these actions and go cover them. But instead, they got in contact with the former chief councillor and a current MLA, who was the chief councillor of the Haisla Nation, and they're one of the bands that went along with having a pipeline going through their land. His name's Ellis Ross, and so they reached out to him to ask him about, so sell us why pipelines are good, and as there's this protest going on in Toronto about what's happening in Unistoten, which we're not going to cover, we want to ask you about, you said yes. Why did you say yes? And so he went on this totally insulting rant about how the people who are trying to prevent the pipeline from going through, they must not be able to relate to hardcore social problems like suicide, employment issues, and starvation in their communities, since they don't want the pipeline. So, and then he described the non-Aboriginal people there as being totally, as just being there to exploit the Indigenous people for their own interests. So, if you're white and you're there right now, this MLA has told the CBC that you're there to use the indigenous people there for your environmentalist ideas, and you don't care about indigenous issues. And then, but yeah, he's said, the indigenous people there are out of touch with the social problems associated with not having a pipeline. And so he was saying they've tried everything and nothing has worked. So now they're going to try the pipeline, and it hasn't gone through. He hasn't seen the benefits, but he's saying this is the only thing that's going to solve our problems. Nothing else worked. He didn't mention anything that they've tried at Haisla Nation. So it'd be interesting to see what kind of programs they've done over the last, several decades, and what the situation at Haisla Nation is like. But he was very insulting toward the Wet'suwet'en and the Unistoten people. It was really shocking to hear his tone and stuff like that. If you want to check it out, then you can go into the archives for As It Happens, and I think it's like 3 minutes into the program or something. So they were airing this during the Toronto Solidarity protest without talking about it, or maybe they did talk about it. I didn't keep track of whether CBC Radio was talking about it. I think they mentioned the protest, but then they wouldn't connect it with the reports that they were making about where it actually was. So now on to the actual news from the activists at Unistoten. So they put out a press release saying they are allowing an unprecedented, allowance of industrial staff onto their land from GasLink, from this one company, just to do survey work. They're not allowing any development, and they're saying we are, committed to. They're not building anything on this land, and so the gist of my interpretation of the gist of that press release was, and I'm interpreting it as a press release, was that they didn't have the resources there to prevent the place from being run down, and so they're stepping back and compromising in this one way, and that they're calling on support so that during this process of surveying and stuff like that, the whole situation can change with pressure from the outside. That's my interpretation of the press release that they made. But I really suggest anyone who's interested go check it out at the Unistoten website. It's in their blog section. It describes the attack on Monday by the RCMP as being traumatic to the band members. And the CBC National reported on this last night. They reported on the agreement. They made a basic, basic thing about it. They also made sure not to mention the protests in Toronto. So on CBC National News, they led the program with a 6-minute segment about drinking water quality on reserves, and then so they did 6 minutes of that, and then 3 minutes about the Unistoten situation, but they didn't mention that the bridge here in Toronto was shut down or anything like that. And then they did a segment about drinking in Russia, and then they did a segment about smoking in China. And there's just kind of weirdly a lot of like drinking and smoking and weed news through the news, and lots of stories about Indigenous water quality, and nothing about protest. The CTV and Global News, the CTV nightly news at 11 p.m. completely avoided mentioning the protest that had happened, the evening leading up to the newscast. They wanted to talk about the Vegas Electronics Show instead. So Global at 5:30 didn't mention it. Global at 6 didn't mention it. And it's not like they're not willing to go out and talk to people, because they went to Pearson to meet a guy who had his 2 new daughters birthed through surrogacy abroad instead of in Canada to save money, but then he ran into problems getting them back to Canada, and now he's got them back to Canada. So they went out to the airport to talk to him. They didn't go and talk with any pipeline protesters. The other thing they do want to talk about, though, of course, is the GM plant. So let's see how much drinking and driving, new drinking and driving provisions, which really are kind of a little bit sketchy and shocking, and I'll get into that in a minute. But find my notes about this. So anyway, yeah, they didn't want to cover this. Okay, yeah, so they're covering the GM activity, which is really, it's GM workers went on strike to protest the lack of GM continuing their, restoring activity at the Oshawa plant. Let's see. One thing that the CBC National did mention was that Trudeau held a town hall meeting about the LNG pipeline in Kamloops, and protesters clashed there. So they mentioned, like, vaguely mentioned about protests across the country. Throughout all this, industry and politicians have maintained a tone in their interviews about how they are patiently trying to work with people, but what they're talking about is them asking for permission after they've already been told no. So they're saying, we've been trying to work with them for 6 years, but what all they've been doing is not taking no for an answer for 6 years. So yeah, so every time they're still maintaining that tone about how they're trying to be really they're trying to be patient, and it's just this sort of inevitable progress thing that just needs to be managed and handled. It's really creepy. It's some real, like, evil empire type of vibes that they're riding. In unrelated Toronto news, moving on, at Islington and Elmhurst, there was in the evening a gunshot. Somebody was shot. Was taken to the ER. About 5 shots. A pedestrian in her 70s was struck by a driver who fled around Shepherd, west of Kennedy. Not sure when that happened. And this is a pretty crazy story. So you don't have to be super close to an airport to have crazy stuff falling on you from the planes. So this family had this, like, big chunk of ice smash into where they changed their clothes, like where they would have been changing their clothes in their house a few minutes later, or whatever, an hour later or something like that. And they're like 25 kilometers away from Pearson. They live in Mississauga. And so apparently there is a way for, airlines and the authorities and stuff to investigate this. But dangerous infrastructure, stuff falling from the Gardiner, stuff falling from the airplanes. So I think it's a teachers association but I'm not. Maybe the union, I forget. I sketched out on it. Are taking the Premier Ford's court or his government's court over the terrible new sex ed curriculum. They're saying they want the new curriculum restored because the old curriculum sucks. The Ford government actually set up a ratting your teacher out hotline so that like concerned parents could call up the Ford government and be like, there's this teacher that's teaching the 2015 curriculum or is teaching stuff outside the sex ed curriculum or something like that. So it's like, those are the teachers that are getting in trouble, are the ones that are, which is, wow, wow. So there's new rules that might like restrict Airbnb a little bit and bring back 6,500 units. I don't know if it's rooms or units or whatever back onto the housing market here, which is it's like the city is watching itself build less and less and destroy more and more of this segment of housing, which is like cheap rentals, rooms or like small units and stuff, cheap units. And now it's going after Airbnb for its chunk of that problem, for apparently maybe sucking 6,000 or 7,000 people out of being able to have a place to rent, and I guess providing 6,500 people with a place to stay at that's not a terrible hotel or a hostel or a box in an alleyway. And so the whole thing that's behind this number and everything is a hotel lobbying group. And so it's, I don't care about this stuff today. It's all about the pipeline. Because on the CBC, they want to talk about this amazing thing at the Vegas Electronics Show that will fold your clothes for you, and how folding clothes is really kind of the bottleneck of the whole clothes management, wardrobe management situation. I'd rather talk about what happened on the bridge yesterday. But unfortunately, I didn't make it to report on it, and there's no video you can find about this online. So the reporting situation on the pipeline situation, this is the big project that's going to take away Canada's ability to, one of the big projects, it's going to put us out of the way of saving humanity from global warming and stuff. And it's the biggest news on that file, and it's the biggest actions locally on that file in the city where all that money is changing hands. And so I want to talk about that. I think that's worth talking about. CTV thinks it's worth making a Facebook post about. So when they posted a picture, not a video, but a picture, and just a little, they just wanted to just barely mention it. So it said more than 100 people briefly blocked rush hour, and this was like a half hour or so. They had a round dance on the bridge. On the Bloor Viaduct on Wednesday afternoon, it was evening. It wasn't really afternoon. It was like evening rush. It was like right at like 5 and 6 and stuff like that. So they were on Bloor, I think on the west side of the bridge or on the east side of the bridge. There's apparently a Danforth Music Hall activity organized or something like that. I need to get better at keeping track of this, like activism stuff. But so CTV did post this, right? So they did post this basically at like 10 or 11, like later on at night. So they're like, okay, it's not going to make it into the nightly news. Let's just post about it online. And on their comments on Facebook, we got 2 Facebook users suggesting that the protesters should be run over. And basically everybody else is suggesting that protests shouldn't be happening, or they should leave, or they should pick some other way to do it. Either they're doing it wrong, or the issue doesn't matter, or whatever, but not a single comment that actually made a point. Incredible. So that is your totally incomplete filling in the gaps morning after news from Toronto for Wednesday, January the 9th. Have a great Thursday.